Okay, reproduction. We're going to look at a couple of different types of reproduction today, asexual and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction includes binary fission, which is how single-celled organisms split. So basically they copy their DNA and then they start to build all the structural parts of their cell until they're big enough, and then they start to split down the centre. So you end up with two identical daughter cells. This happens through mitosis only, so most of your cells go through asexual reproduction every day as you divide and replicate those cells, but bacteria, that's the only way they make more organisms. Another form of asexual reproduction is budding, and this happens in plants and also some hydra. So in this potato, the eyes have started to grow. They will form new potatoes, and if you planted this, you'd end up with a big bunch of potatoes growing off it and a whole new potato plant. Asexual reproduction means that all of the offspring are identical to the parent. Sexual reproduction is different. Sexual reproduction is where we get genetic diversity, and as you can see, animals and plants both reproduce through sexual reproduction, as we'll see in a moment. So binary fission only through mitosis, and identical daughter cells, and a good example of this is cloning, so they're actually producing exact copies of the parent. The advantages of binary fission is that it's fast, only one parent is required, and the disadvantages are that there's no genetic variation, and this means that if a antibiotic is introduced to a plate of bacteria, all of those bacteria are theoretically identical, and they will all die. If one's susceptible to the antibiotics, then they'll all pass away. But the amazing thing is that as these cells replicate, they replicate quite poorly, and so little errors are built. And if an error produces an advantage to the organism, then it will survive. So, for example, if the right genes are interrupted or added in with the genetic material being reproduced, then one bacterial cell may become resistant to the antibiotic, and then when the antibiotic's introduced, all the other cells will die, and that one will start to divide and become the dominant form of the bacteria in the population. Some other things that grow and divide by asexual reproduction are things like starfish, and if you chop off an arm off a starfish, it will start to divide and form a whole new starfish, and the arm will regrow. Some lizards do this too. Sexual reproduction involves meiosis. So not only do all your cells divide by mitosis once they're made, but the original two half cells or haploid cells are formed through meiosis. Now, because you get one from the male and one from the female parent, there's genetic variation as the information within the nucleus is split into two halves, and that splitting is quite random. So each parent cell has a different combination of the DNA. This makes those organisms much better able to adapt to changing conditions. And as I was saying earlier today, it's actually not as important the survival of one individual. It's more important the survival of the species. So the more variation we have, the more likely that species is to survive. The disadvantages are that it's slow, it takes a lot of resources, a lot of energy. You need to find a mate, and of course not all genetic variation changes are good changes, and some cause illness. Okay, let's have a look at meiosis. So in meiosis, there are two parts to meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. In meiosis 1, the DNA splits into two daughter cells. This happens by all of the chromosomes lining up in the central plate. The spindle fibres come down and attach to those chromosomes and then shorten up toward the telomeres. Once those two daughter cells have been split like that, then it happens again, and this time only half of each chromosome goes to each end, and that produces 4 haploid, we call them daughter cells, even though they're male in the first case, and in this case they would be sperm cells. In gamete formation in the female, it's a little bit different, because when the first division happens, one cell is quite large and will go on to make the egg. The other one forms a remnant body called a polar body. It actually has a lot less material in it. And this happens again the second time as well. So you end up with 3 little polar bodies and 1 actual egg. Okay. Really important to learn these words, haploid, diploid and triploid. And basically they mean the number of copies of each chromosome that the cell has in it at any one time. So here in plants we've got the pollen in the anther. And the anther is the male part of the cell. Inside the anther, the pollen grain will form through meiosis and become a little pollen grain. It's a haploid pollen grain. It's only got half the genetic material to make a new plant. And it has to rub off onto the stigma, the female part of the plant. It then goes down the pollen tube until it meets the ovule at the bottom. The ovule is the female reproductive cell and is again a haploid cell. So once those two combine, the pollen and the ovule, they form a 2N zygote and then produce the new seed. So just going through the reproductive parts again, the anther is the little pollen-covered ball at the top, up here. The stamen is the long part that holds the anther up, and the stigma is the very top of the female reproductive part, and the style goes down to the bottom, and the ovule will be down the bottom here. Now, this is an image of that ovule starting to grow and reproduce. Now, the fruit is actually produced in that ovule. The ovule will become the fruit. So you can actually see the remnants of the flower here on this fertilized ovule. You can see that where the eggs, or rather the seeds, will start to form in the middle there. And this thickens and grows, providing food ready for those seeds to develop and grow. And of course, when the fruit falls off the tree, there's a ready source of food and nutrients for those seeds to start to grow. It also gives them a way of spreading their seeds from one place to another, because animals eat those seeds and poop them out somewhere else with a lovely pile of fertilizer. Now, the interesting part here is the time length between the first cell division at 0 to ripening on day 146 for these apples. You can see that cell division happens quite quickly in those early days, and the cells just get bigger and bigger and bigger after they've divided so far. Starch begins to accumulate between days 35 and 87. That starch will continue to be a major food source for this plant over time. Eventually that starch is used up. The plant uses that energy as it grows and it ripens, and it forms simple sugars, which makes the fruit sweeter, which is why we like eating apples as they're a little bit older rather than a little bit younger when they're still very Okay, reproductive organs in animals. Most animals have the similar structures, they're just in different shapes or different formats. So here we have a female dog. We have the vulva, the opening to the female genitals, the vagina, which is the internal part of the female dog, and at the very top there is a cervix, which is a small muscular disc or round opening that opens and closes to allow the baby to be trapped inside until it's ready to be born and opens up ready for the birth. You then have the uterus, which in dogs is split into 2 parts. Fallopian tubes at the top, and the ovaries where the eggs are developed at the very top. Now the uterus is where the babies will grow and develop inside the mother. And as you can see, these are quite long channels in a dog because they're going to support more than one baby at any one time. Unlike in humans, where ours usually support one baby, sometimes two, sometimes three, very rarely more than 5 or 6. In the male, there is the testicles, which is where the sperm is produced. Then there's the long tube that carries the sperm, called the vas deferens, the prostate, which adds in fluid, and also the bladder, which will drain down the same opening through the penis as the sperm will come through. So these both come down through the urethra. Now, dogs are rather interesting. They actually start off mating with the male mounting the female, and then they halfway through or shortly later, about as this picture suggests, 5 to 45 minutes later, they actually have a second stage of coitus where the dogs actually both stand on the ground but are still coupled, and this allows a lot of time for that sperm to be injected into the female, but it also leaves both dogs vulnerable. So you can see in this picture how those genitals are coupled together. So you can see that the penis is extending quite a fair way, and it actually has to rotate to face the other direction. This places the head of the penis right at the top of the vagina near the cervical opening and guarantees more transfer of sperm. Now, I want you to have a look at these little puppies. We're going to look at them in a bit more detail in a minute. But I want you to think, what do you see here? What do you notice about these puppies? So what do you notice about them? Well, you can probably notice that one of them looks like their mother and has the same brown fur. You may also notice that the other puppies are quite different. 2 of them are white with spots. One of them has brown spots, another one has black spots, and there's actually another darker brown puppy in behind. Now, dogs can have more than one father for their offspring. However, this genetic variation can happen because of the recessive genes within the dog's genetic makeup and the way that they're coupled. Just like a blonde and a brown-haired dog could end up, a blonde and a brown-haired adult could make blonde offspring or brown-haired offspring or somewhere in between. Dogs can do the same thing, and that's that genetic variation that we were talking about. There are quite a few reproductive technologies available now to allow people who have an issue in their reproductive system or animals to have children or offspring. So in this case here, we're looking at artificial insemination. I believe this is a dog, the animal that they're artificially inseminating. And basically this device is injecting sperm into the dog's vagina, right up close to the cervix. This might happen when a stud animal is several thousand kilometres away from the female, and that people will purchase just the sperm rather than moving the dogs for safety reasons. It might also happen in rare and endangered animals when there's a lot of distance to travel between one mate and the other, or in zoos when they're doing breeding programs, they try and increase the genetic variation, especially when they've only got 2 or 3 of the same type of animal. So they will often purchase sperm from another zoo rather than moving, say, an endangered white rhino halfway across the world. So this process is called artificial insemination. The semen is being artificially inserted into the other dog or the other animal. Intercytoplasmic sperm injection means, or ICSI, refers to sperm being placed in a glass test tube and being inserted into the cytoplasm of the ovum. Now, this treatment is used often when the tail of the sperm isn't as motile or as healthy as they could be. You might have heard of people talking about good swimmers and bad swimmers before. Sperm that can move quite quickly are more likely to survive long enough to reach the egg. Sometimes hostile environments, like very acidic or very alkaline vaginas, will also kill off a lot of sperm. This doesn't make this a good way of contraception or anything, but it can lead to infertility. Also, other diseases like endometriosis, which might block the fallopian tubes, or other damage, or even some sexually transmitted diseases can cause scarring of the fallopian tubes and prevent the egg from reaching from the ovary down the fallopian tube and into the uterus to implant in the wall. So if sperm doesn't meet egg, no baby will be born. So ICSI provides a way for less motile sperm to actually get into an egg. In vitro fertilization is where the eggs are removed from the woman's body, which also occurs in ICSI, but this time they're just allowed to combine by themselves. So a sperm sample and the eggs retrieved from the ovary are both placed in a petri dish and allowed to combine. After a short while, and the cells start dividing, the blastocyst is checked for health, and when they think that it's going to be a viable embryo, they implant one, sometimes two or three, into the uterus. And in vitro fertilization does have a higher rate of twins and triplets, but because the process is very expensive and very invasive on both the mother and the father, a lot of parents want a higher chance of success. So they ask for more than one fertilized egg to be implanted into the uterus. And if both of these take, or all three of these take, then the mother will give birth to multiple babies. So these are only a few of the reproductive technologies available. You may wish to investigate some more.